As part of your book, you share that the single most important change for your brain health is to reduce inflammation from carbs and seed oils. Can you explain how those foods affect your brain health?
Yes. So refined carbohydrates and refined vegetable oils, so both of these ingredients come from whole foods, but then are factory processed into these very refined products that do damage our health. They no longer behave like foods in the body. So sugars, flours, cereals, fruit juices, and vegetable oils such as soybean oil, sunflower oil, canola oil, both of these ultra processed ingredients, which are really the signature ingredients of the standard American diet, the so-called standard American diet, or the ultra processed industrialized diet, both of these ingredients directly contribute to inflammation throughout the brain and body and something called oxidative stress, which is why we are always told that we are supposed to eat more foods with antioxidants, which is a strategy that doesn't really work very well. But these are the ingredients that can directly cause some of these brain damaging forces. These are, when I was trained to become a psychiatrist back in the late 1990s and early 2000s, I was trained to think of mental health problems as chemical imbalances in the brain to be addressed with medication. But we never really stopped to think about, well, what's causing those chemical imbalances in the first place? And we now understand that inflammation and oxidative stress are two of these really powerful, deeper forces that underlie those chemical imbalances. So the refined carbohydrates, for example, which are essentially naked carbohydrates that turn instantly into glucose in the bloodstream and can cause exaggerated spikes in glucose in the bloodstream, these also cause exaggerated spikes of glucose in the brain. And so the higher the blood sugar, the higher the brain sugar. And whenever you're getting these excessive waves of glucose in the brain, you are setting off waves of inflammation and oxidative stress throughout the brain, which is very damaging, physically damaging to the delicate architecture of the brain, but also destabilizes brain chemistry. Those neurotransmitters that we're always told are the root causes of psychiatric conditions, things like imbalances in serotonin and dopamine and melatonin, and these two very important neurotransmitters in the brain that we don't hear as much about, glutamate and GABA. So all of these brain chemicals can be thrown significantly off balance by these waves of inflammation and oxidative stress that can come from eating refined carbohydrates and seed oils as well. The way the seed oils do this is that when linoleic acid, which is the omega-6 fatty acid that's high in a lot of the vegetable oils, the brain absorbs that linoleic acid and then tries to burn it for energy. The brain isn't supposed to be burning these long fatty acids for energy. It's supposed to be burning small molecules like glucose and ketones, because when you burn small molecules, you get a lot less inflammation and oxidative stress. So these two signature ingredients of the modern diet, these are directly contributing not just to the physical damage of brain architecture, but also to the stability of our brain chemistry.
Thank you. That was so helpful and so succinct. I don't have a follow-up question per se with what you just shared, but my thought is, well, then I'll just become plant-based, right? So if I don't eat the highly refined carbohydrates, I don't eat a ton of the refined sugar, well, then wouldn't a plant-based diet, so I eat mostly vegetables and the plant kingdom, could I be healthy off eating that way?
Well, I like this question because there are really two answers to this question. In order to make your diet a brain healthy diet, you need to do three things. So what we just talked about, you and I just talked about, was the protect piece. You want to protect your brain from inflammation and oxidative stress. But there are two other things you also need to do. So if you follow whole foods principles and you don't eat any junk, you don't eat refined carbohydrates, you don't eat sugars or cereals or products made with flour, and you don't eat any vegetable oil, and you stick just to whole foods, that is a very important principle to follow, and that will protect you to a large extent against the most common causes of inflammation and oxidative stress that come from the diet. But there are two other things you also have to do. One is you have to nourish the brain. And that means you have to eat foods that are capable of delivering all of the essential nutrients that you need to the brain cells. And if you are eating no animal foods at all, then you will not be capable of delivering to the brain all of the essential nutrients it needs. The only way you can try to remedy the serious nutritional holes that are in even the healthiest sort of whole foods vegan diet, even the healthiest version of that, which would be based primarily on whole foods, would be by including a significant amount of fortified processed foods, because you can't fortify a whole food, and lots of supplements, which not everybody can access or afford in the world, and which also are not the ideal way for us to obtain our nutrients. We absorb and process and regulate nutrients differently when we extract them from whole foods versus when we take them in the concentrated form of a supplement. So there are some challenges to eating a brain healthy diet if you're not including any animal foods at all. But I do like to say that I am nutritionally pro-choice, meaning I want to help everybody, regardless of their dietary preferences, have access to better brain health, improve their brain health. Now, ideally, when I follow the biology and the logic of nutrition, what I arrive at is a food that is where the core is animal foods. But there's a lot you can do if you prefer not to eat animals. There's still some important things you can do that will improve the brain healthiness of your diet, if you will, if you have the right information. And then the third piece of the third pillar of a brain healthy diet, so we've got nourish, we have protect, is also energize. And this is the other piece of the puzzle that people, regardless of whether they're eating plants, animals, or both, can pay attention to, which is your glucose and insulin levels. Because if your glucose and insulin levels are not kept in a healthy range, your brain energy supply will be compromised over time, and you will gradually lose some of your ability to turn glucose, use carbohydrate for energy. And so if you're eating a so-called plant-based diet, if you're eating a vegan diet, for example, even if it's a whole foods diet, if there's too much carbohydrate in it for your personal metabolism, your glucose and insulin levels will run too high, and that will be problematic for you. So regardless of whether you're eating all plants or a mixture of plants and animals, you still need to pay attention to those glucose and insulin levels, because simply eating whole foods, plant-based, or even whole foods paleo diet may not go far enough to normalize and stabilize your glucose and insulin levels.
And would you say that the best way to track your glucose is maybe getting a monitor like the CGMs or getting blood work done?
The absolute best way, if you can afford it, is with a continuous glucose monitor. Actually, even wearing one right now. So here in the United States, just until last week, we used to require prescription to obtain a continuous glucose monitor. People needed to get a prescription from a prescriber to access continuous glucose monitors. And even with a prescription, they can be expensive because they're only covered by insurance under certain circumstances, such as insulin-dependent diabetes. But now, here in the United States anyway, we now have access to at least one brand of a continuous glucose monitor without a prescription. And so things are changing really rapidly on that front. And then in many other countries, they've been available without a prescription for a long time. So most European countries and Canada, they've been available without a prescription for a long time. But yes, ideally, if you can afford one, using a continuous glucose monitor, which is simply a painless patch that attaches to the skin and lasts for about 2 weeks, and that's measuring your glucose pretty much around the clock for about 2 weeks in a row, that will give you really valuable, personalized information about how your food choices and other aspects of your lifestyle, like exercise and sleep and stress and alcohol, affect your personal metabolism. And anything that's raising your glucose too high should be avoided if you want to really protect your brain and body health. So there's a whole chapter in the book about exactly how exactly what your goals, what you want your glucose goals to be. And although I can certainly summarize them here if you wish me to, I'm happy to do that. But the goal is to keep your glucose and insulin levels in a healthy range. The CGM will tell you, just give you volumes of wonderful, empowering information about how the carbohydrates in your diet are affecting your personal metabolism. And that's a big part of the story. But the part of the story it won't tell you is about your insulin levels. Because you can have beautiful glucose levels 24/7, and you can still, depending on what you're eating, have high insulin levels. That's much harder to assess at home. There are ways you can do it. But one test that I recommend in the book that people get is to not just get a fasting glucose level, which most doctors do order when you go in for your physical, but to also ask for a fasting insulin level. It's a very inexpensive test, even just $10 or $15, even without insurance coverage. And that will tell you not just what your glucose level is at that point, that's your fasting glucose, but how much insulin is your body needing to produce to manage the amount of carbohydrate in your diet. Because what's happening over long periods of time, if you're eating too much carbohydrate for your metabolism, is your glucose may be perfectly normal because you're pumping out so much insulin to keep that glucose in a normal range. So you don't just want to know what your glucose level is, you also want to know about your insulin status. Because if your insulin is working hard to keep that glucose in a normal range, that high insulin level over time is going to damage your brain metabolism. So that is another piece of the puzzle that's harder. It's harder to assess that piece.
Are there other instances from other than just eating a lot of carbohydrate rich foods that then your glucose may be higher, so then insulin works enough to manage that level, so then your glucose looks within range but your insulin's out of range? Is there other scenarios where where glucose may look okay, say that you're not eating a ton of carbohydrates but your insulin is still imbalanced?
Yes, particularly protein powders, most importantly, dairy protein powders, and the worst offender is whey protein powder. So whey protein powder raises not glucose levels. Your glucose will not rise. There's no carbohydrate in whey protein. It's protein. It's pure protein. But it's dairy protein, and dairy proteins are different. And so casein and whey are both isolated dairy proteins, and they're in all kinds of so-called keto-friendly snacks and bars and shakes and cereals and cookies and other kinds of really popular keto-friendly foods because they don't contain any carbohydrate. But whey protein in particular, casein to a lesser extent, they don't raise glucose levels, but they raise insulin levels substantially. Whey protein raises insulin almost as much as pure glucose does. And therefore, whey protein will give you a really decent insulin spike. And this is not something that I recommend to my patients. I advise all of my patients to avoid dairy protein powders for best results when they're trying to get their insulin levels under control.
Are you able to release ketones? So a lot of the people in the keto space may use whey protein and they're still producing ketones, but could their insulin still be high because they're using the whey protein?
Yeah, so we were just talking a few minutes ago about how it can be harder it's easier to assess your glucose levels at home than it is to assess your insulin levels at home. We don't have yet any direct way of measuring insulin levels at home. This is why, you'd really need to get this fasting insulin level, which is something that you can order yourself through a laboratory such as ownyourlabs.com, which I do recommend, or ask your doctor or nurse practitioner to order a fasting insulin level for you. But there is kind of a backdoor way to assess your insulin levels at home, and that's using a ketone meter. Because as many of your viewers may know, insulin and ketones have a reciprocal relationship, meaning you cannot produce ketones unless your insulin levels are low. So in order to produce ketones, what needs to happen is you need to turn your insulin levels down enough to the point that fat burning switches on. And when fat burning is switched on vigorously enough, then the liver will turn some of that fat that you're burning, whether it's coming from your plate or from your body fat. If you're burning fat vigorously enough, the liver will turn some of that fat into ketones. It'll chop it up into these very small pieces of fat, these fragments of fat called ketones that dissolve easily in the bloodstream, circulate throughout the brain and body, and can cross the blood-brain barrier and bridge any energy gaps that might be there and help the brain restore the brain to full energy capacity. So ketones are wonderful, but they can only be produced when your insulin level is nice and low. So when your insulin is low, your ketones will be high, and vice versa. If your insulin levels are high, you won't be able to burn fat. Fat burning will switch off, and you will be in fat storage mode, and you won't be able to produce, you'll be able to produce virtually no ketones. Your ketones levels will be very low, usually well below 0.5 millimole on a blood ketone meter. So when you're looking at your ketone level, you're in essence looking at a mirror image of your insulin level. So if your ketones are very low, let's say they're undetectable up to maybe 0.4 millimole, your insulin levels are you can guarantee your insulin levels are high. If your ketone levels are 0.5 or higher, the higher your ketone level is, the lower your insulin level is. So it's sort of a way to look at a mirror image of your insulin levels.
For some of the keto carnivore people that eat this way for a long time, we do see a subset where their insulin gets too low. Do you ever think there's a too low definition? So meaning that maybe their insulin, when they measured, it's like 1.5 fasting. And I know, so that's on the lower end. Is there ever a point where you think it might be too low?
This is such a good question. It comes up a lot in my clinical training program. So I've been teaching for more than 4 years now, clinician training program in ketogenic diets for mental health. One of the questions I get all the time is there an ideal ketone level to treat mental health conditions? Another question I get is, can your ketones be too high or too low? And they can absolutely be too high. So for most people, I would consider a ketone level that's, if you're spending too much time at 4 millimole or higher, I mean, it's okay to float up there from time to time. But if you're spending a lot of time up in that higher range, you're kind of edging into starvation range ketosis, where you don't want to spend a lot of time up there because you'll be risking malnourishment. But then the other question is, could your insulin be too low? So if your ketones are very high, that means your insulin is very low. So how high is too high ketone-wise? How low is too low insulin-wise? So we know from people with type 1 diabetes that yes, that insulin can absolutely be too low. So people with type 1 diabetes, they have an autoimmune condition that damages and destroys the cells in the pancreas that are producing insulin. So people with type 1 diabetes, which is not the same as type 2 diabetes, people with type 1 diabetes, this is an autoimmune condition where there is virtually no insulin being produced by the body anymore. And that is a very dangerous and deadly situation. We do need a certain amount of insulin. It's kind of what's called basal insulin. We need a certain amount of baseline insulin being released into the bloodstream at all times in order for our cells to function properly. Cells do require a small amount of insulin at all times. And so can you, with diet alone, drive your insulin levels down so low that it's metabolically unhealthy for you? Theoretically, you could, but this would again sort of reflect a starvation state. So if you're not eating enough food for your personal needs, your insulin level will be too low, your ketone levels will be too high, and that will be suboptimal for your health. For example, to be very concrete, women of reproductive age can lose their periods if their insulin levels go too low, if their nutritional status goes too low, if their ketones are too high. You can see in certain cases, for example, in women who are breastfeeding, if they follow a very strict ketogenic diet, there have been published case reports of women ending up in the hospital because of ketoacidosis. This is not something you'll see in most adults who do not have type 1 diabetes or who are not taking certain medications. These are special states. Pregnancy and breastfeeding are special metabolic states where you need more insulin in pregnancy and breastfeeding, because pregnancy and breastfeeding are special states of growth and production. cell division. So insulin is a growth hormone. If you don't have enough insulin, you will not be able to support a healthy pregnancy. You will not be able to feed two people. You need more food, you need more calories, you need more protein, you need more nutrients, you need higher insulin levels. So there's a lot of nuance in this answer, but the bottom line is, yes, it is possible for your insulin levels to be too low, just as it is possible for your insulin levels to be too high.
Yeah,